In this video tutorial we're going to look at a basic overview of the impulse sampler that comes with Ableton. First thing I'm going to do, however, is access my sample folder from within Ableton itself. So I'm going to click on Add Folder and I'm going to navigate to where my samples are saved. So in this case I've got them saved on my desktop within the folder called User Samples. Inside here I have 3 subfolders. For the purpose of this I'm just going to select the sample folder and click on Open. It now appears in my places, giving me direct access without having to leave the interface of Ableton. If I click on User Samples, it gives me access to those 3 subfolders, and I'm going to be using the drum one-shots in this tutorial. So, I need to insert the impulse sampler into a MIDI track. This is found within Instruments, and I'm just going to drag it in. It then appears at the bottom. We have 8 pads. Each one of these can be assigned an individual sample. Below here are some editing parameters. These are specific to the pad that is selected from above. And down the right hand side are our 3 master controls. These affect all the pads simultaneously. So first thing we need to do is add a sample. This particular sampler is best suited for percussive sounds, so I'm going to just keep it simple and just use drums. So I'm going to go into my user samples, open up my drum one-shots, and I'm going to start with a bass drum. I'm going to put it onto my sample. All the parameters below control this sound. If I want to audition it, I can click on the little play button, or I find the corresponding key on the MIDI keyboard. In this case, it's C1. I can see that I have MIDI information down the left hand side, and obviously I can hear the sample being played. If I go up the keyboard, you'll see that I can trigger the 2nd pad, 3rd pad, 4th pad and so on. But currently, as I have no samples inserted onto these pads, we hear nothing. I'm going to make up a very simple drum kit here, so I'm going to add a snare drum into my 2nd pad, and I'll insert a closed hi-hat into my 3rd. We could insert all of them to create a full drum kit if we wished. So I have a bass drum, snare drum, and a closed hi-hat. With the pad selected, so I'm going to start with the bass drum, and I'll demonstrate what some of these parameters do to the sample itself. So the start allows us to trim any silence off at the beginning should there be any. Now I don't have any on this particular sample, but if I demonstrate the parameter to you, we've taken away all of the start, the initial transient. It may be something that you want to experiment with depending on the sample you're using. The control underneath that says soft, with that highlighted, just allows a slightly softer curve at the beginning. It can eliminate any clicks that you may hear depending on where the start position is. I'm going to leave it set at 0 milliseconds. Transpose allows us to pitch the instrument, or in this case the drum. And stretch allows us to time stretch. It will work in the negative, but with short samples it's not as obvious. Next along I have a drive control. Now this needs turning on. It's essentially a saturation. Allows us to add a bit of grunge, a bit of distortion to the sound. So I'm going to turn saturation on and then turn the drive button up. Following this I have a filter section, so again this needs turning on. By default it's set to a low pass filter, but we have a selection of different ones we can use. I'm going to leave it set to low pass for now, and here's our cutoff frequency. We also have a resonance control, so if I turn that up and reduce my frequency, effect of it there. Next along I have the decay of an ADSR envelope. So this controls the length of time the sample is played for. Its default is 2 seconds, but if I feel that the bass drum is ringing out a bit too much, or I want to shorten it, making it a bit punchier, I can reduce its time. Below this particular control is an orange button that by default is set to trigger. That means that when I press the key, then the decay begins straight away. I can switch this to gate. What this means is when I release the key, the decay begins. So if I have it set down quite low, I can press and hold the key and hear the entire sample. But if I press the key very quickly and let go, it acts as a gate operating at 18 milliseconds or thereabouts in this case. So it could be useful to cut off noise at the end, should you not want it. We then have a pan control. This assigns our sample to either the left or the right. And an individual volume control for the particular pad. The 3 controls here, so is a master volume, a time stretch for all of the samples, and a transpose for all of the samples. I'll just spend a couple of moments looking at these lower controls here. These allow parameters to be altered depending on, in this case, velocity, or you can set it to randomize. So, for example, if we look at the transpose, if I turn my velocity to 100%, pressing the key at different velocities will alter the transposition without us actually having to change it within here. So quiet ones will be lower, harder hits will be higher pitched. And you can set a percentage of how much that impacts on the sound. The random percentage control essentially just randomizes the transposition for every time that the sample is played. And the same is true for the stretch. So if I turn this to 100%, the velocity will alter how much time stretching is taking place. And there are 2 modes, A and B. Have a slightly different sound to them. This control can also be used on the pan. So if I wanted it to randomize the pan, let me just reset the time stretch percentage. So if I turn pan all the way up to 100, depending on the velocity will dictate whether it comes out the left or the right. And again, I have a random button underneath. And finally, I have a velocity. This is essentially the number of velocity points that I can use. Its default is 70%. If I turn this up to 100, I can now control samples from 0 all the way up to maximum volume, depending on how hard I hit the key. I'm going to leave it set to 70% because that seems to work most of the time, but we can change that if we need to. We also have a mute and a solo button for the individual pad. These can also be accessed from up here, so we can mute the sample or we can solo the sample from here as well. If I have a sample that I don't particularly like or I want to change for whatever reason, I just select the sample and it opens up the hot swap control when I hover over it. So if I click on this, it by default opens the folder where the original sample was stored and gives us access to everything else. So if I wanted to change this, for example, to an open hi-hat, all I do is click on it, double click on it, sorry, and that now becomes an open hi-hat. I can close the hot swap mode. It's very quick and easy. Alternatively, I can just drag a sample back over on top and replace it that way. As I mentioned before, we have an overall time stretch. So if I turn that all up, every sample is now being time stretched 100%, irrespective of where I have these controls. And the same is true for transpose and main volume.